All right. Hello, and happy to be with you. Um, I've been involved with FHIR since before it was called that and stick my fingers into all different sorts of different FHIR pies. Most relevant for today is I've been the technical lead and primary author for the SDC specification since it was originally a glimmer in what was then the U.S. Office of National Coordinator because they were the initial sponsor. And I've been working with under the sponsorship of the National Library of Medicine for 6 years now or so on the most recent versions of the SDC specification. Uh, I know most of it as an author, and the folks that you will hear later in the day know even more about certain aspects of it than I am. But my role here is to give you an introduction into what the heck SDC is for the large portion of you who are new to it. This presentation is licensed under Creative Commons. If you send me a PM on chat.fhir.org, happy to give you the original deck if that's useful to you and you are free to use it in your own organization. I make use of slides that were originally contributed by Brian Postlethwaite, who you hear from later, and I threw my name in there, so if you include this, you're good to go in terms of reuse. So what the heck is structured data capture? To understand the need for structured data capture, you need to know a little bit about how FHIR itself works. We've got lots of resources in the FHIR specification. Two of those that are most relevant today are questionnaire and questionnaire response. And when we designed the resources, we did so from a perspective of we don't want to include absolutely everything in the core resource. We have experience in trying to include absolutely everything in a specification. It was called HL7v3, and it produced a specification that was really abstract, where you could say the same thing a whole bunch of different ways, and we didn't really get the interoperability we were looking for. So with SDC, well, with FHIR in general, we introduced a rule called the 80% rule, where we only include content in the core specification if we believe that most implementers, i.e. roughly 80% or so, will actually support that particular feature. And when we get into questionnaire, that creates a bunch of challenges because questionnaires are used everywhere in healthcare. They're used for administrative purposes, for intake forms, for checklists, for clinical research, for claims processing, everywhere. And there was a wide range in levels of sophistication and levels of capabilities in the questionnaire space, which meant that if you looked at what most systems supported, it was a small amount, but when you looked at what the community at large needed, it was a large amount. And so in FHIR, when you have needs that are beyond what fits into that small core of the core specification, the solution is an implementation guide. And so SDC's role as an international implementation guide, we don't have a ton of those, but SDC is one of those. And actually, I believe the first of those, not the first implementation guide, but the first international one, is to fill in all of those gaps, to add support for the different features that some portion of the community needs, a decent enough portion that it makes sense to try to standardize across the world, but that was not sufficiently common to justify including it directly in the FHIR core specification. And when we went out looking and saying, what do people want us to add? There were a whole bunch of different answers, and there's continued to be more answers coming in over the 10 or so years since SDC was first out there. So what do we cover? We cover workflow, we cover a whole bunch of additional rendering capabilities, we cover additional form capabilities, we cover automatic population and extraction, the ability to, rather than defining your forms or all your questions in advance, to questions and submit answers via an operation. We have modular forms, and we have the ability to derive one form from another. And so in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to quickly walk through what all of those things are. I'm not going to be able to get into detail about how everything works, because that set of presentations runs a day and a half or more, but you will have a bit of a shallow dive into some of these topics. Well, actually, even a deep dive into a couple of them from the presenters later on in the session. And of course, there's lots more material out there if there's other things that you want to learn. So what do we mean by workflow? First of all, it's standardizing of terminology. So what are the types of systems that are typically involved in the questionnaire space, so that when you say, I support questionnaire, you can do so in a useful fashion. Because in practice, it's not actually possible to say, I am SDC conformant. That's not a meaningful statement, because you can do all kinds of different things with SDC, and just hearing that you're SDC conformant doesn't tell me at all what you do. So we've defined a common set of capability statements, trying to sort of set a bar for what features we would typically expect from a system that does this, so that we have a language to talk about conformance in a more productive way. And these are not mutually exclusive. You can be both a form filler and a form manager and a form response manager if that suits your needs, or some other combination. And then in addition to that, for each of these roles, we say, what are the types of things that you need to be able to do? With FHIR, we have RESTful capabilities that say, do you create, do you update, do you delete, do you search? If you search, what search parameters do you support? Do you support any operations? If so, which ones? And are you initiator or a recipient of those? And so we define all of those things. In addition to that, we talk about some of the core features that you often need to have in any kind of a form-based workflow. So how do you search for forms? What are the expectations in terms of search criteria that you want to be supporting? How do you engage with terminology in terms of expanding value sets or finding code systems? How do you get somebody to say, hey, I would like you to fill out this form? How do you let them know that? How do they say yes? How do they say no? How do they send the form to you? If you have a submission process where you're not necessarily soliciting, but you need a place where people can send completed forms for processing, how do you do that? How do you keep track of where somebody's at? How do you create forms using other forms? All of these are parts of the workflow process, and SDC tries to provide answers for all of them. It is not exhaustive, so there are absolutely things that you could do with questionnaire and questionnaire response that SDC doesn't cover, but we try to cover the vast majority if we possibly can. In terms of rendering, the base specification gives you all of the building blocks. You can have questions, you can have sections, you can have display items that provide hints. It indicates all of the different data types. It says if things are required or optional. But there's a whole lot of things that people have wanted to be able to do. They want to be able to say, I would like this question to be a slider, or I would like to display this set of questions in a grid. And there's a bunch of different ways you can define them in a grid. We're in discussions about how do you create a graphic diagram of a patient's body or something else, and that people click on it to answer questions. People want colors. People want bold and italics and control over those kinds of things. People want questions that are hidden, where they're gathering information behind the scenes, whether that's a score or an analytic information. We want to be able to prompt people so that if you're entering in a postal code or a phone number, that you enter it in consistently, as opposed to just ad hoc strings, which can be all kinds of weird stuff. And we've got 40 or 50 different extensions that we've defined to help guide what things look like in terms of rendering. The other thing that we do, or one of the other things that we do, is define complex form behavior. So there's some limited behavior in the core specification. We have enable when, where you can turn on sections or questions or turn them off based on certain criteria. But sometimes that's not sufficient. Sometimes you need more than just this question has this answer in order to control turning things off. You might need to base it on a score. You might need combinations of ands and ors and more complex logic. So we give you that. Um, we can let you turn individual answer choices on or off. We can have invariants that span your form. We can control what values look like. So minimum lengths, minimum values, maximum values. We can limit if you're doing attachments, what kind of attachments you're allowed to receive, so that somebody can't send you a WordPerfect 2 document or something weird like that. That they don't send you a terabyte radiology image because that tends to make phones unhappy. Constrain units of measure, tighter cardinality expectations than the core specification, which is basically just you have to have at least one, and you can have more than one, but it doesn't get into more than that. Sometimes we want to be more precise. One of the things that's cool about FHIR questionnaires is you can have answers that are pointers. So rather than saying, what is your general practitioner's name and maybe phone number, which is what we typically have to do in a paper form, we can say, hey, here is a list of practitioners in your region. Please pick your GP, and have an actual pointer to a registry entry that lets you discover everything. And in the event that there are multiple Dr. Smiths out there and you don't know your GP's phone number, you can actually find the right one, as opposed to filling something in on a paper form and nobody having a clue. But the base specification doesn't give you a heck of a lot other than you can have an answer of type reference. And SDC says, well, it'd be nice if we could say what kind of resource we were pointing to, and maybe what server to go look up the list of allowed values from, or maybe even let you create a new resource instance on the fly if you don't find what you're looking for. SDC has all of that. Sometimes we want to do calculations. So we're calculating a score, we're calculating a total, we're calculating some other type of statistics. We can build forms up of other forms. Again, there's probably 40 plus extensions that define additional behavior capabilities within SDC. One of the things that's got a lot of attention in SDC is pre-population. And pre-population, the objective of it is to solve the problem that all of us have faced when we encounter the healthcare system. Somebody gives us a form, and the first thing that it says is, what's your name? What's your gender? What's your date of birth? What's your health identifier? Do you have any allergies? Do you have any of this list of conditions? And all of these questions. And we were just there last week, and they know all of this information about us. We're quite certain that it exists within their EHR, EMR, HIS, whatever it happens to be. And why are they making me dig into my pocket to figure out what my health identifier is yet again? It's silly. It wastes everybody's time. And wouldn't it be nice, given that this is an electronic form that we're filling out rather than a paper form now, for it to just fill in the things that it already knows. I mean, the reality is some of what it knows might be wrong. Maybe I have a new phone number, or maybe the date of birth is still wrong in the system, and I would really like you to update it. So I will correct it yet again and hope that this time it sticks. But it would be nice if we could fill that in. If you are a provider who's filling out an insurance form and it is asking for certain recent lab values, or how long the patient has been on this particular medication, or that sort of thing, again, that information exists in the system, and it's not super productive to have the provider have to wade through their EHR to dig up the answer. It makes much more sense if the data is available electronically to just go in and get it electronically. With population, we've defined a number of different mechanisms to support the population process uh, based on observations, based on FHIR path, and using structure map. We didn't do that because we like to make things complicated. Healthcare just is complicated, and questionnaires are complicated. And we developed these three different mechanisms because they represent different optimization points. There's different trade-offs. Observation-based is the easiest, but it only works if the data that you're going after actually is an observation value. If it lives somewhere else in the FHIR interface, that's not going to help you. FHIR path gives us a bit more control, but requires more work to write and requires more knowledge. Structure map lets you do anything you can possibly imagine, but relies on a skill set that isn't super common in the FHIR world, at least not yet. And so it's more of the harder end of SDC, but we absolutely have people who are doing that and using it. So you sort of pick which one you want, or in some cases you pick a combination because you do the observation for the easy stuff, and then you use one of the other mechanisms for other kinds of things. And SDC defines how all of this works and defines profiles and questionnaires that want to embed this metadata to support populating the form. Because if you don't have metadata in the form, there's no standard way for a system to do this. Extraction does the reverse. It says, okay, I have now completed a questionnaire response, which is great. I've got an admission form. It contains the patient's current meds, it contains their allergies, it contains their health conditions, it contains recent history, which is great, except that if I have a gazillion completed admission forms for this patient that all have their allergies, and I've got forms from a bunch of different organizations that all have allergies, but all represent them in different ways. And I want to ask the question, is this patient allergic to penicillin? Questionnaire response is a lousy way to try to find that out because there isn't a standardized representation. The data lives somewhere in questions, possibly nested, possibly with meaning influenced by other questions. Is this my allergy or is this an allergy of somebody that I'm related to? You need to understand all of the questions in order to figure that out. And particularly once we start sharing information across organizations, trying to extract anything like that out of a questionnaire response is really difficult. And so often we want to use questionnaires as a data capture tool where we can capture anything we want. There's no limits in terms of what kind of data that you can gather using a questionnaire. And it gives us a very simple mechanism for doing that data capture and a very tight mechanism for doing that data capture. But once we've got the data, we'd really like to surface it in a more standard way. And FHIR resources like observation or allergy intolerance or other resources, so we can search for it in a standardized way. And I can find, is this patient allergic to penicillin, or what is the most recent blood pressure that I have for this patient, or whatever. And as with extraction, we have multiple different options for using this for performing this process with different trade-offs. Observation-based, definition-based, template-based, and structure map-based. Template-based is the newest and one I'm most excited about, and you're going to hear more about that today. But again, you can mix and match and use whatever makes the most sense for the type of data extraction that you're trying to do, recognizing that some of these mechanisms are a bit more technically complex than others. And again, we embed metadata into the questionnaire to support tools doing this in an automatic fashion. So you don't have to go and write custom Java or C# or whatever language you prefer code for every single questionnaire to make this happen, because that doesn't scale terribly well. Adaptive forms says, but what if I have an AI that's going to be asking questions and it doesn't define all of the questions in advance? How do I make that work? Or I have a set of questions, but I don't want to tell you what all of my questions are because that's proprietary. Or I have an admission form, but it's a super sophisticated admission form, and it has a whole bunch of conditional logic, and there's 10,000 questions in it. And if I give that to your iPhone, it's probably going to be unhappy with me. But because in practice, I'm probably only going to ask you 6 or 7 of those questions, or maybe if you're a really interesting patient, 25 or so, but not all 10,000. How do we make that work? And the answer is adaptive forms. With adaptive forms, instead of saying, here is all of the questions organized into all of their sections with enable whens or enable when expressions or whatever that turn things on or off based on how you answer, I'm just going to have a very simple form that says, hi, I'm a form. This is what kind of form I am. When you're ready to fill me out, go hit this endpoint. And you go hit that endpoint and say, what's the next question? And it says, here's question number 1. What's your name? Okay, cool. I know what my name is. Fill that in. And I put that into my questionnaire response, pass that into the operation, and I say, what's the next question? And what is your request? Okay, I fill that in, and I say, what's the next question? I originally put together this example probably 6 or 7 years ago, and Dan Vreeman was taking the course, and he said, did you know that there's a secret in LOINC? There are actually standard questions in LOINC for all of these things. The first one shouldn't be a surprise because what is your name is a pretty common question to ask on forms. But yes, we actually have standard LOINC codes for all of these things. So that's how adaptive forms work. And eventually you'll get to the point where you have asked the final question that the engine at the back end wants answered. And instead of when you say, what's the next question? It will come back and you won't have any new questions. You'll just have a completed questionnaire response with a list of questions and a list of answers that is specific to this particular session and to you with the information that has been gathered. And then you can submit that or do whatever you need to with it as you would any other form. Compositional forms are aimed at the designer in the questionnaire space. We have organizations that have question banks because they do clinical research, and they have learned through hard experience that it doesn't make sense to let researchers make up their own questions all of the time because they're not necessarily that good at it in terms of creating language that is understandable across the whole range of consumers, coming up with questions that tend to get answered consistently, or even just asking the same question the same way in 10 different forms, because that makes the life easier in terms of comparing the data, but it also makes life easier in terms of people filling out the forms, because they start to understand this is how this question is asked, this is what it means, this is how I fill it out, and so there's less cognitive load on the people who are answering. There's also folks that say, you know what? I have a demographic section in 90% of my forms, and it asks the same questions. And when somebody says, you know what? We're going to change the list of gender options, or we're going to add in the ability to ask for pronouns, or we're going to now enforce standards in terms of what postal codes are allowed to look like. The people who author the forms get really sad when they have to go and make those changes to 278 different forms. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just have one place where we define that demographic section, where we could go update it and then press a button and have it propagate into all of our forms? And so compositional forms lets us do that. It lets us create questionnaires that reference other questionnaires, or lets questionnaires have questions in them that instead of defining the full text of the question and the data type and all the population logic and extraction logic, etc., it says, I am question 123, go find my definition over there. And you have a lightweight questionnaire where all of the juicy stuff is maintained in a central location. And then once you have that, you can press a button and turn your lightweight questionnaire that's referencing a whole bunch of other stuff into a heavyweight questionnaire that's actually ready to be completed. And so SDC defines that for us. If you haven't read SDC, that's the URL. I'm not going to walk through the specification because we don't have time to do that. But it is relatively complete. Do look at the support option in the menu. It will contain a link to the Zulip stream that we use for discussing questionnaire. And if you run into questions, and you will run into questions as you are implementing, please do come to the community and raise your questions there. It's a pretty vibrant community. It's pretty responsive. Occasionally we'll say, that's an excellent question. We don't have an answer, but at least then you know that we don't have an answer. But much of the time, we will be able to give you some guidance, and even if there are multiple answers, we'll at least sort of nudge you in the way that's consistent with how most existing systems function. So we do have a little bit of time for questions, so happy to answer things here. And of course, if you have questions after the fact, that I just realized that color scheme, blue on orange, vibrates a wee bit much. Apologies for that. But come find me on chat@phir.org, and happy to answer things there as well.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. It was
do we have
very... Yes, we had several questions that were addressed, but I would just go through. Like, the most popular question is, will there be a recording? The answer is yes. The recording will be as soon as possible, and we will share the recording via emails and also post it on our YouTube channel. And also we'll post to the FHIR chat so that the people there are also aware of. So the question from Arthur, he asks, how can the integrity of the form content source be quantified? For example, form completed by a patient or a physician or an automated field from data extraction.
So the base questionnaire response does have the ability to indicate who the overall author of the questionnaire response is. So you know that this was completed by patient or the patient's mom or somebody else. And that field is not so much about who's typing in the information, but who is responsible for the answers. So if you have a nurse who's asking the questions, but they're typing in what the mom is saying, then that's still being authored by the mom. If you wanted to do that on an individual question by question basis, there's a couple of possibilities there. The standard one is to use provenance. Provenance lets you capture all kinds of metadata, and it does have the ability to capture metadata on an element by element basis, but that's a heavy way of doing that. I have also seen people who didn't want that heavy approach define custom extensions for that purpose. SDC doesn't actually define standard extensions for that because the needs tend to be variable. So what level of metadata do you want to capture on the individual questions varies quite a bit. And because it varies, and because there is a standard way of doing it, even if it is kind of heavyweight, we haven't sort of found a sweet spot of not so heavy, but one that works for a large number of folks. That doesn't mean that we couldn't do that if there starts to be a community census of, well, yes, there's a bunch of things that people want, but there's 30 or 50% of the community that always wants X. Can we at least define a standard for that? We could. We just haven't had anybody come forward to ask for that who has had any evidence that they actually represent a sizable portion of the community.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left, and I think we can handle one more question. Please feel free to use Q&A tab to give your questions to make sure that they are answered. But the question is, I want to ask a question about someone's allergies, medications, or problem. How would this be modeled and linked to the FHIR resources?
So it depends. As I mentioned, there's both population and extraction. So are you trying to get data in from data that already exists in your FHIR API, or are you taking completed information and trying to move it out into those resources? The extensions that you would use would be different. And the extensions are also different depending on what mechanism you're using. If you're gathering observation type data, like what is your blood type, then you can use observation-based approaches. If you're not, if you're gathering information from allergy intolerance or putting it into allergy intolerance or medication statement or something like that, then you'll need to use one of the other mechanisms. And part of it also comes down to how closely aligned is the set of questions that you're asking about the allergy or the medication or the problem and the data structure that is used um, in the resource. If it's closely aligned, then something like FHIR based or definition based can work relatively well. If there's more transformation required, then template based or structure map based might be more appropriate. But regardless of mechanism, the short answer is extensions. We embed extensions into the questionnaire that provides metadata, pardon me, that then lets you perform that population or extraction process. And we will drive more deeply into at least a couple of those mechanisms in later sessions today. And if you want information about the others, there are recorded sessions from Dev Days and others that'll give you a bit of a deeper dive into some of the other approaches.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Most welcome.
Please feel free to share the questions to Lloyd. I'm pretty sure he will address in the Q&A tab during the conference. Once again, thank you so much.